everyone. Welcome to this open forum session, which is entitled A Wake-Up Call from Nature. I am Magdalena Skipper. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Nature, which is a multidisciplinary journal publishing original research as well as science journalism. It's my great pleasure to be here leading this fantastic panel and being here with you as well as with you who are joining us remotely. Just as a reminder, this is an open session, so feel free to tweet or share your reflections on social media. If you do so, please use the hashtag WEF22. And also there's a second hashtag OpenForum22. A reminder about the structure of our session. So we will have a discussion here with my esteemed panelists for about an hour, after which we'll have half an hour for questions from you, from the audience. One thing I should share with you that Minister who is with us here will have to leave us after the first hour, won't be able to stay with us for the remaining 30 minutes. So without further ado, let me set the scene for our discussion. So a wake-up call from nature. So I rather suspect that many of you in the audience, like myself actually, are thinking that our session is mainly motivated by the pandemic, which of course is still ongoing. And I suspect that you'll be partly right. We've seen, but this is only partly true, because we've also seen rising temperatures in many parts of the globe, raging fires and flooding, so much so that in some parts of the globe homes have become uninsurable. We know from a series of science-based reports that our time is running out to reverse climate change and loss of biodiversity, to really transform the food systems also, so that we may have no hunger on the planet. All of this profound impact on our planet and on us, since we are part of the planet's ecosystem, clearly impacts us as well, as I just said. But this realization that not everything is well is not new. In fact, it's far from new. 50 years ago already, we had an influential report entitled Limits to Growth, followed by Stockholm Declaration. Both emphasized the need to manage development by considering natural resources as well as economic and social concerns. So we've known for at least half a century that we need shifting that in a wider context. So Viviane, what about from your perspective as a minister, from a governmental perspective, what are the responsibilities, what are the key issues?
Well, first of all, what I really enjoy in this panel is that it can be quite a difficult subject and complex subject. And I think it is very important as people who are very involved in it, but and very knowledgeable, that you also take your time to translate it in a way that everyone understands what we are talking about. And as a relative newcomer, I really understood what you were saying when it comes to viruses, for example, and that's very, very important to also raise awareness, because I think that that is one of the first responsibilities that also governments have, but we share that responsibility, in my opinion. And what is also very important is to exchange knowledge. I spoke to my colleague in Ecuador as well today, and we really exchanged best practices and also some concerns, because they are doing very important things in Ecuador when it comes to, for example, creating a circular economy, erasing plastics from the system, because at the Galapagos Islands they really have a big challenge when it comes to plastics and changing habitats. But more than 80% of the pollution does not come from the country itself. It comes even from other parts of the world. So we can be the best kid in the class, as we would say in Dutch, but it doesn't help us, especially the Netherlands being a very small country, if we don't share the knowledge that we have, and if we don't make sure that we team up with other big countries, with companies, and create enough awareness that we don't have 2.7 planet Earths, and we are using up 2.7 planet Earths at the moment. We will run out of resources at some point. I come from a region where we had big floods not that long ago. It was in the south of the Netherlands. We are very specialized when it comes to water, but we also use our small country very intensely. And we have issues when it comes to soil and water management in combination with the extreme pressure that we are putting on our nature and on our globe. And in Belgium and Germany, it was unfortunately even worse. People died of floods in 2021. That's what we're talking about at the moment. And we have to change our mindset. And the good thing is that it's coming. And as the Netherlands, we want to also play our part in that. But we will have to do it together, because you cannot do it alone. And one of the other points of attention, in my opinion, when I'm talking about using up 2.7 planet Earths, we need to also raise awareness among consumers and really make them aware, and that's what I talked to my colleague from Ecuador about as well. How can you make sure that everyone feels part of the transition that we have to make? Because our ancestors, several centuries ago, before the Industrial Revolution, they were much more in tune with nature. They lived with the seasons. And I'm not saying we have to go back several centuries, but we have to raise awareness about the fact that we cannot continue the way that we are doing now. So also investing, for example, in innovation is something we can do as a government. And that is what we do. We try to stimulate companies, but also universities, to come up with good and better solutions. And I hope that we will continue to do so.
Very important points. And I particularly enjoyed your example, your reminder to all of us that sometimes we think that global is in opposition to local. But actually your example, for example, of pollution, that may become an acute local problem that actually has global or much broader provenance, illustrates the point very well of the interconnectivity of the problems and solutions. That it's just a matter of scales, right? Local versus global scale. Absolutely. Stefan, what about from your perspective, from perspective of the private sector that's been very much in the public eye, part of collaborations, conversations with governments, researchers at this intense time? What's the responsibility and the opportunity?
Sure. So if you think about the we, as you described it, governments, academia, business, not-for-profit, consumers, I don't think we are doing enough, all of us. And as my colleague said, time is our worst enemy. And I think this is one of the notions that I think a lot of people don't appreciate, and I'll come back to it in a minute. And so I think as a business, we have to lead, and we just have to do, using the best science, to try to be at the forefront of what can be done. And what I really want to do with Moderna is to try to set the example to other companies, because companies tend to be competitive, of what can be done. And we have this unique opportunity that the company is growing and it's still new. So we don't have thousands of plants that have been built 50 years ago. So we're building new plants as we speak, including one, for example, in Kenya. And we said very clearly the goal to the team, which is use the best material, the best technology available. You should not try to save a few $1 million. You need to do it because we're going to be with 40 years with this plant. And this has to be net zero. And there's just no way around it. And I think, as my colleagues have said, if you set a goal, then you achieve it. As humans, we're very good at getting things done. And so you need to have a clear goal. And I think the role of business is really important, because one of my frustrations as a citizen of the world is we've been talking about this climate issue for as long as I can remember. I'm turning 50 this summer. And I'm very disappointed in general by governments in terms of this. A lot of things we could have done for a long time that we decided because it was not popular not to do. And I think that I have a responsibility as a CEO of a company to make sure my company uses the best technology to reduce our footprint on the planet, to impact our employees and how our employees behave, because they have families, they have friends, and so if they set the way, that is great. I think consumers have a huge role to play into it, and one of the things that makes me optimistic, because I'm an entrepreneur, so I have to be optimistic, is the young generation. I think the young generation, and I think David is a good example on this panel, gives me a lot of hope. I stopped eating meat because of my 18-year-old daughter, who for actually a couple of years, I was super slow, and I apologize. And for a French guy, stopping eating meat is a big deal, no more steak frites and other things. And I think that's something that everybody can do. If you're 50-year-old, French guy can do it. I think really anybody can do it. It's just a question of setting the goal, and then you just move on with your life, and you can have a great life. And I think we all have to do this, because if, as a business leader, I impact my employees and they impact their friends and the community where we live, is step by step we're going to get the world a better place. On the point of time, I want to make an analogy to the pandemic, which is most people do not realize that a lot of the laws of nature are not linear. And our brains are, as humans, thinks linearly. That's how we're wired since we used to live in the forest when there was nothing else. And I saw it in the pandemic, and I was shocked by it, because you had so many people like, yeah, it's only a few cases, Like, guys, can you do any modeling? Because viruses go pretty fast. It's going to be everywhere very, very soon. And I think we have the same issue with the climate, which is people think we have time. People think it's somebody else's problem. But I worry that we might even have passed the point of no return, because there's so many negative feedback loops on the planet that we do not understand yet. We have to be very humble. It's like with biology. We have to be very humble. It's a very complex system, and I think every day matters. And all of us, all of you guys in the room, we can all have a huge impact.
So, two things you said I wanted to follow up on. The first one was your statement about governments, the fact that you're disappointed with governments. So here's the thing. Most of us live in countries where we elect our governments for a relatively short period of time. The issues we're talking about here are long-term issues. There is a discrepancy here in the sort of goals and interests of a government versus longer-term goals and interests of nature. Anyone on the panel, would you like to comment on this? Should we be somehow demanding something else of our politicians, of our government? Should we be electing them on a different basis? Change our electoral systems? Any comments on that?
I think it's not the electoral system that's a problem here, but the people who basically elect. It's not a homogeneous mass. It's, as we said already, the we, right? It's business leaders, it's young people, it's elderly people. There are different interests that are always fighting between political candidates and the candidates who can represent them the best. And oftentimes these interests, oftentimes people who are already established from existing sectors, right? Because the climate change is something that disrupts a lot of old industries. These old sectors, they have a lot of power and also hold a lot of interpretation power, and therefore can influence a lot in that voting system. So I don't think the voting system is the problem here, but it's more like, how do we make people understand from all sectors that this is an issue worth sacrificing potentially profit, worth sacrificing other plans, because it's so urgent that we need to address it immediately because of the exponential growth of the problem that we potentially can face.
Absolutely, and this indeed ties in with the second comment that you made that I wanted to sort of amplify here for the panel maybe to comment on. And that's this issue of time combined with linearity. If we look at, again, coming back to the title of our discussion, a wake-up call from nature, the nature alarm clock has been ringing for quite some time now, and yet we're sort of asleep or half asleep. The pandemic came, and the intensity of the problem made us do actually quite amazing things together, right? It's not perfect. Let's not get too excited, because of course there are parts of the world which fared much less well than others, but we did do amazing things collectively. and collectively across the sectors and across the globe, at least parts of the globe. And yet, we have another huge emergency. Well, we have many, but of course, climate change is probably the most obvious one. But because it unfolds with a different dynamic, we somehow stay asleep. So, as you just said, David, how do we convey that sense of emergency? I mean, many have tried. Interesting question. Marco, are you sitting forward?
This is a topic I absolutely love because it does really connect to two major weaknesses of our species. First of all, we have been evolving ourselves under the same natural laws of any other animal. It's not like we're special. And we've become cultural very, very recently compared to our biological history. So we still have inside, and I am a great believer of behavioral genetics in many ways, we still have inside the urge of hunters and gatherers like we started in the very early days. With a difference that we're living today in a capitalist development economic model and in a highly powerful technological society. So the only way to, and that has happened in the last 70 years with the promotion of technology and the rise of capitalism, we've been hitting nature very heavily. And by the way, we have also exacerbated inequality in the world at the same time. So how do we mitigate that natural, unfortunate, natural urge to gather resources and not distribute by understanding that it is a threat? And I'm saying this publicly, which is a little bit tricky because it's a bit provocative, but actually in natural laws, the survival instinct of any individual, of almost every species, reacts very strongly to a threat, because a threat is what makes you feel for your life. And so that's, I think, what's happened in COVID. I'm Italian. I wasn't in Italy at the time, but my family was. Italy was one of the first countries hit in Europe, very heavily, with a lot of casualties, as you remember. I never seen Italians more compliant with regulation and laws than on those days. And I say this with great respect and great admiration for my own compatriots, because people were very worried, very worried. And so I think we need to go back to what I said at the beginning. We need to really internalize that climate change, nature loss, from overfishing to use of pesticides, the way we deforest in order to grow our food, etc., are all things that ultimately are going to hit us. They are a threat to us. They're an existential threat for humanity. More than us, our children, in fact, but not longer than that. The horizon of the impact is very close. So I think we have to culturally overcome our unfortunate, maladapted natural instinct that was okay when we were living in the forest like any other species, but now that we live in such a powerful society able to alter geophysically the planet, not just biologically, we have to just internalize that and refrain, constrain our behaviors, because at the end of the day, that's what we need to change. The way we live, that's the big systemic change that we need to see happening soon.
Can I respond to that? Because I think that's a very good analysis. What is very important when taking measures also as a government is public support for the measures that you're taking. And politics has become somewhat faster over the last couple of years. People also change faster. It used to be the case that people really chose for a political career, but now it is people are relatively short in office. And the problems that we have take a lot of time also to analyze. I mean, I only started very recently. I'm very passionate about the topic, but I still have a lot to learn. And I also hope I will have the time to really make an impact. But I will need time. I need to invest in my network, and I need to learn from everyone, for example, here at the World Economic Forum, to see how I can really make an impact back home and to also translate it to the rest of the world and to help them take some extra steps. And in order to do that, I think it is also very important for us politicians and companies and also academics to take everyone along in the transition. And that means informing them, but it also means, I always say, if you live in a rented home, which has single glass, which is badly isolated, you cannot afford solar panels on your roof, and you have a gas bill that goes literally through the roof, as I said earlier today, then you don't feel part of the transition that we're talking about today. So we always have to keep an open mind to the people that are being forgotten. One of my colleagues I spoke to earlier said we should leave no one behind, and I think that is really the case in this transition that we're going through.
Very important point, which actually brings me to a topic which we touched on before. And this is something I know that, David, you work with Indigenous people, people who live in the forest. And, you know, a second ago we were talking about bringing everyone along on this journey, regardless of where they are in society and what their capability is. It's important that we remember that we bring along the Indigenous people, people who live in local communities, be it in forests or in the countryside in general. Tell us a little bit about that engagement and, in turn, what we can learn from those communities, how those communities can guide us in listening to nature.
Maybe a little context on this. So I, like Isabella, actually was or still see myself as an aspiring scientist. So I don't expect myself actually to sit here. Over the last years, I've joined the COP United Nations Climate Change Conference by just random coincidence, first as an engineer, joining some random student event, then looking more and deeper into the issues that are on this international level. First as a scientist, trying to explain with the V, okay, good, we have this technology, there's a climate urgency, I'm young, I'm gonna get like a lot of these effects. Why don't you understand me? Understanding slowly, okay, different people, different interest groups speak different languages. Some people, like young people, like to speak about the urgency, but other business-oriented people like to speak about the price, and threat is, for example, experienced differently. For example, a threat to your current business model is potentially greater than the existential threat our planet is serving. So we are in this panel, we are of course like fortunate enough to see the threat as the existential threat in the planet, but I can promise you that not everyone agrees on this existential threat as well. And this really pushed me towards moving out of the ivory tower of science and trying to understand why people don't get it, right? And when I was attending these COP sessions, I realized that just learning about the effects of nature, which is one of the least appreciated areas where we potentially have the most impact in climate, but one of the least financed in all of climate finance, like literally 3-4% of all the climate finances goes actually into nature, that the people who decide these climate finances are also not the people who steward nature. Like if you look at the numbers, Indigenous communities and local communities in the Global South, they make 5% of the world's population, but they protect 80% of the world's terrestrial biodiversity. That's an insane number. But if you walk around Glasgow, Madrid, Bonn, all these climate conferences, they're barely having a seat on the table. That's why the climate youth movement like Friday for Futures is trying to have Indigenous people walking in front of the protests such that photographers and journalists can take pictures of them, and they still don't take the pictures of them. They'd rather take pictures of Greta. Greta's not speaking and leaving them to speak, and still they are getting ignored. And my work is basically very much trying to see, okay, they are a rich community protecting us from a climate catastrophe. Where, for example, using my scientific connections, I work with the Kaiapó people in Brazil. They are protecting a connected forest area in the Amazon rainforest that is the size of Iceland. There are 10,000 people. It's one of the highest deforested rates of forests in the world. If you burn down that forest, it will be the emission of the United States in a year. And they are having trouble raising funds, having trouble getting their voices out. I mean, look around there. Rarely, you don't see a lot of indigenous people around at the WEF as well. So really, really, really what's important here is to not forget who are the real superheroes that are protecting us right now from a climate catastrophe bomb through nature, people who are protecting at the front lines, people who have contributed the least to destroying nature on the climate catastrophe, but suffering the most from its effects, from the changes, from destruction of nature, also from the inequality that we experience here. And this is basically also the reason why I decided to sit here and tell you about this story.
And what is the best way to, so they are clearly engaged because that's their life. What's the best way for us to bring them to the table, to the discussion, so they can inform our own thinking for what needs to be done and how it needs to be done?
I think one of the most important parts is to understand that indigenous wisdom is often differently expressed than scientific Western wisdom. But there's so much value in it. For example, we did a paper with an indigenous colleague, and she was talking very in an eye perspective and about how to best preserve and restore forests and replant areas. And she was talking about, for example, this flower needs to be in this area because of sunshine. And we literally, without looking too much, and it's also a little bit our fault in South America, things are done very hectically, and we didn't have time to double check her essay that she submitted. We had really bad feedbacks from reviewers saying, who did you hire to write this report? Okay, making this flower, like humanizing this flower, right? Because this is not the scientific language you're using. But me, on the other hand, thinking, okay, this reviewer potentially would never know as much as this person who's like planting and taking care of these flowers, but the language and the acceptance for this knowledge is missing, right? So one of the things I think is really important for us is to understand that these people have doing a tremendous work, suffering the most, and we do need to emphasize this every time we work with nature. We talk to our policymakers that, hey, we already have a really good steward there. Just let them behold the land, let them do what they can do best, like we let business do what they can do best if we have the right incentives for like a clean transition.
And so that goes back to the comment that Viviana made earlier about exchange of information, right? Across different stakeholders, perhaps speaking different language, but recognizing that different stakeholders can make a contribution. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on that. So I think one problem is maybe also that nature is seen as something that is free, that doesn't have a price. But we know, for example, when you work, for example, on viruses or on antivirals or on substances, that we maybe still have a lot of unknown, let's say, substances, plants, mechanisms in the wild that could also help us for medicine. So, for example, it's known that in rainforests, due to this high diversity, maybe the next antibiotic comes from there, or maybe the next drug that is effective against cancer comes from one of these plants. And we would be willing to pay a high price for a drug or for a vaccine or maybe for a new technology, but because it comes from nature, we consider it not really worthless, but we don't really see the price of this resource that we have. And I think that that's maybe also something that could be enforced, that protecting this will also give us something back, because we might discover something new. And also we know that forests and also ecosystems, they work like a buffer against diseases. And we know that preventing a disease is much cheaper than having to deal with a disease. And I think that might be also one aspect that we don't really value what is out there.
Absolutely. Marco?
That's a fundamental point. I think we are just not valuing nature. We are not pricing nature. Bees never send an invoice, and we should pay for the pollinators that produce two-thirds of our food. And back to your comment, Minister, I think it's super important. We need to, that's exactly what we are. We are in the middle of a transition, at the beginning of a transition. We need to support the transition, But we need to support it by valuing nature, but also, I have to say, we need leadership. It's true that government needs the support of the people, but also government is supposed to be leading as well, like businesses, like civil society, like everyone in our own space. We are still in this crazy situation where there are $1.8 trillion spent by governments around the world, including the European Union, for subsidies to sectors like agriculture, fishing, forestry, energy, that are actually supporting nature-negative activities. And it is possible to redirect those subsidies towards nature-positive activities. It is possible. It's still spending money, is not letting people down, but is spending it in a different way. I know it's not easy. Don't get me wrong, I'm not making this simple. But that's where we need to come together and ride this moment of awareness, because people are beginning to be ready to that transition. You can see on energy more than anything else, but on food, it is also possible in agriculture. So that's the time. And I may be worried. I'm going to make a comment on the war of Russia and Ukraine, because there is a massive destabilization of the food system, inflation going up the roof. It was a long time that a war wasn't involving big economies, big supply chain players like Russia and Ukraine. And so we are all feeling the pinch, and the most vulnerable countries even more so around the world, as usual. But we need to be careful at this time of crisis, like COVID or like the war, not to go back, not to fall into the temptation to say, oh, this is scary, let's invest in intensive agriculture, let's invest in more drilling of oil and coal in Europe. Poland has just proposed to start again the trading of coal within Europe. I mean, we have to stop coal. Coal is the dirtiest of the fossil fuels. So we should not go back. We should take the opportunity of a crisis, whether it is a pandemic, whether it is, unfortunately, a tragic crisis like the one in Ukraine, to actually move forward, not to move backwards.
Absolutely. And then the question then becomes, how do we leverage that synergy of leadership from governments, but then the industry, the sort of the private sector, so that the funds go where they should go, as opposed to in this retrograde fashion that you just gave an example of one proposition, and the societal direction. We don't have an economist on the panel, of course, but that would be another interesting voice. We are actually coming to the end of our allotted time for this conversation. But before we wrap up, I wanted to ask each one of you to give your recommendation or your wish. You know, we all agreed with the fact that from each of your perspectives, from our collective perspective, we know very well that, you know, as I said earlier, nature has been ringing the alarm clock for a long time, and we know we're in trouble. We also know time is running out, and we also know the problem is not linear, as Stefan said. So it's an emergency situation. What is the single thing, do you think, would make the biggest difference in us collectively sitting up and taking action? Not just talking about it, we've been talking about it for a long time. Stefan, I'm going to start with you.
So I will not respect the rule. I'm going to propose two. One of the things around what we eat. I just say if we just all stop eating meat, I think there will be a huge impact right away. Doesn't need any law, doesn't need anything, it's just behavior. And the other one is around use of energy. You know, you can decide when you buy a car, do you need a car or not? You know, can you go by bicycle or public transportation or whatever? And what type of car you decide. This is all things we do ourselves.
Thank you. Viviane?
Well, I think one of the things we really need to do is raise awareness of the situation that we are in and the role that everyone can play themselves in transitioning towards a new and more sustainable model that the Earth can manage. And as a government and as governments, I hope that we will continue to innovate and stimulate innovation. Obviously, and I completely agree, leadership is necessary from a government perspective, but I would say from all levels. It's important in academics, it's important in business life, it's important when it comes to NGOs, and it's important when it comes to inhabitants of this planet. Everyone has to step up and take responsibility.
Isabella?
Yeah, I can only agree with Stefan. So I think if there's one thing that every one of us can do, it's probably what we eat, and it's probably stop eating meat or eat less meat, because we know there are many effects of livestock, building a bridge for new pathogens, also increasing antibiotic resistance. So it's something we did not talk about. It's not a virus. It's also sometimes called the silent pandemic, because it's not so obvious, but it's a huge problem. And it also helps to make better use of the land that we have already for land use, so not to increase that. It's probably the biggest thing that everyone can do. And it's easy, I think. So there are many alternatives now.
Absolutely. Marco?
Yeah, definitely food. Food production on land is driving 80% of deforestation today, simple as that. And overfishing in the ocean is equally destructive. And so definitely sustainable food.
David?
Food was mentioned, so I'm going to raise another issue, which is climate funds. So we've been pledged over the years, $100 billion for climate. The countries and governments have not delivered any of these numbers anywhere close to it. One of the best ways to stop deforestation, it's clear, is to pay and support these local communities, indigenous communities, and global south countries in having a sustainable alternative that they can, there's no evil player here. It's really like there are no options. And with money from the global north that can support the global south, we could create new economic opportunities that don't require to destroy the forest. And the money is missing. Push your governments, raise awareness, because this is only not going anywhere if the money is not flowing.
Thank you. So very interesting. We had a number of calls here just now. Certainly raising awareness, innovation were mentioned, but by far and away, almost all panelists agreed that actually where we can really make a difference is something that each one of us has control over, really voting, so to speak, with your feet. Change your diet, and we will make a huge impact on the planet. It's actually very simple, but so effective. Incredibly, in my view, it's an incredibly encouraging message, actually. It was so empowering as well. So with this, I'm going to pause our discussion, because unfortunately, Minister Heinen is going to have to leave us for other duties. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. So I'm going to open up for questions from the floor. Please, if you have any questions, there's a microphone. There's a question already here in the front row. Please.
Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to take your insights back to my organization and figure out what we can do better. My question is on the topic of the cost of sustainability, and not necessarily from an investment or transition perspective, but from the perspective of the consumer. And I know the topic of food choice came up, which draws a nice parallel. Now I'm from New York, and prices may vary, but if I want to get a salad, it's going to cost $15 versus a cheeseburger that costs 99 cents. Now, those with the means have the ability to choose between the cheeseburger and the salad, and similarly, those with the means have the ability to choose more sustainable but often more expensive products and consumption habits. And so, as Marco mentioned, the 3 billion people in developed countries versus 5 in developing, there are obvious implications around reducing the price point for sustainable options. And so I'm curious if any of the panelists have any insight around what is being done or can be done better in order to make sustainable consumption more affordable.
Excellent question. Would anyone, Stefan?
We needed the minister, because this is what, what governments really have to normally regulate, but maybe Stephen.
Yeah, there's a few things we can do. One is local farming and eating in season. I think we have become part of a 20th century culture to want whatever we want all year long. And this is what drives, as you know, a lot of the costs. So I don't know we're going to really have a way to go and fight the 99 cents burger, because unfortunately that's what they cost. But I think if we can really help a local community, to create farms and eat what is in season, I think you start to make a step forward.
I would highlight again the regulation dimension, and I think the intervention of governments from subsidies, redirection, to actually capping some of the cost. What happened right now with the cost of fossil fuel? It's gone up, everybody feels the pinch. In some countries, really, is bringing down the livelihoods of poor families that can't afford those prices, yet Shell has tripled their profit in the last 3 months. Tripled. So there's something wrong here, and I think government needs to step up.
Maybe one aspect is also if you would calculate the true price of this piece of meat in this burger, it would not be 99 cents. It would be much, much higher if you would calculate all the costs it has on the environment, on producing animals at such a cheap price, on the risks that you have, maybe because you need antibiotics, you have all the waste from this farm, then the true price would be much higher. So I think in the end, it's not a natural given that the prices are like that, but it's a factor of decisions and of regulations that it's possible to produce something like that at such a cheap price.
Sorry to intervene again, but for example, renewable energy, thanks to a mix of government intervention, the global goal on climate, and of course investment from the private sector, solar energy that 20 years ago was unaffordable, today is competitive with coal for sure, it's cheaper than coal, and it's cheaper in many places than oil and gas. So it can happen. It can happen. The transition can happen if both corporate sector and governments align in making it happen.
I join the opinion of my fellow panelists. I think it's probably unpopular to hear, but it's like some things have to be more expensive in order to make sure that the market's actually correctly reflected. For example, we take all the services a beautiful natural forest does for us, for example, clean air, clean water for granted for free, and that's not reflected in any of these markets for cheap meat, right? And if we would put the real price, if we can measure that and put the real price into the economy, you will see that things are much, much different.
Absolutely, but thank you for the question. I think it's a really, really important question of the affordability of sustainability, and I think Minister made that a related comment when she was talking about somebody who lives, for example, in rented accommodation, doesn't have the choice of energy supply and so on. I think that's an important question. And of course, indeed, us putting pressures on our government who can regulate or help regulate this, for example, through taxation, in addition to the other suggestions that were made. Are there any other questions or comments from the floor? There's a question here in the middle.
Thank you. I think most of the inventions we had in the last 60 years at least are mainly driven by economy, by economic interests. And we start realizing that not all of them are favorable